First observation, the emperor has been reproached first with having resigned the dictatorship at the moment when France stood most in need of a dictator. Second, with having altered the constitution of the empire at a moment when it was necessary to think only of preserving it from invasion. Third, with having permitted the Vendéans to be alarmed, who had at first refused to take arms against the imperial government. Fourth, with having assembled the chambers when he ought to have assembled the army. Fifth, with having abdicated and left France at the mercy of a divided and inexperienced assembly. For, in fine, it would be true that it was impossible for the prince to save the country without the confidence of the nation, and it is not less true that the nation could not, in these critical circumstances, preserve either its happiness or its independence without Napoleon. We shall make no reflection on subjects which have been minutely canvassed and treated of at length in the 10th book. Second observation, the art with which the movements of the different bodies of the army were concealed from the enemy's knowledge on the opening of the campaign cannot be too attentively remarked. Marshal Blucher and the Duke of Wellington were surprised. They saw nothing, knew nothing of the operation which were carrying on near their advanced posts. In order to attack the two hostile armies, the French might have outflanked their right or left or penetrated their center. In the first case, they might have advanced by the way of Lille and fallen in with the Anglo-Dutch army. In the second, they might have moved forward by Givet and Charlemont and have fallen in with the Prusso-Saxon army. These two armies would have remained united, since they must have been pressed, the one upon the other, from the right to the left, from the left to the right. The emperor adopted the plan of covering his movements with the Sambre and piercing the line of the two armies up Charleroi, their point of junction, executing his maneuvers with rapidity and skill. He thus discovered in the secrets of the art means to supply the place of 100,000 men, of whom he stood in need. The plan was executed with boldness and prudence. Third observation, the character of several generals had been affected by the events of 1814. They had lost somewhat of that spirit, of that resolution, and that confidence by which they had gained so much glory, so much contributed to the success of former campaigns. First, on the 15th of June, the Third Corps was to march at 3 o'clock in the morning and arrive at Charleroi at 10. It did not arrive until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Secondly, the same day, the attack on the woods in front of Fleurus, which had been ordered at 4 in the afternoon, did not take place until 7. Night came on before the troops could enter Fleurus, where the commander-in-chief had intended to establish his headquarters the same day. The loss of 7 hours is very vexation on the opening of a campaign. Thirdly, Ney received orders to advance on the 16th with 43,000 men, who composed the left under his command in front of Quatre Bras, to take up a position there at the break of day, and even to entrench himself, he hesitated and lost 8 hours. The Prince of Orange, with only 9,000 men, retained on the 16th until 3 o'clock in the afternoon that important position, when at length the marshal received at 12 o'clock at noon the order dated from Fleurus, and saw that the emperor was on the point of attacking the Prussians. He advanced against Quatre Bras, but only with half his force, leaving the other half to cover his retreat at the distance of 2 leagues in the rear. He forgot it until 6 in the evening, when he felt the want of it for his own defense. In the other campaigns, that general would have made himself master of the position in front of Quatre Bras at 6 o'clock in the morning. He would have routed and captured the whole of the Belgic division, and either turned the Prussian army by sending a detachment by the road up Namur to fall on the rear of their line of battle, or by the rapidity of his movements on the road of Genappe, and would have surprised and destroyed the Brunswick division on its march, and the 5th English division as it advanced from Brussels. He would have afterwards marched to meet the 3rd and 4th English divisions, which were advancing by the way of Nivelles, and were both destitute of cavalry and artillery, and overwhelmed with fatigue. Ney, who was always first in the heat of battle, forgot the troops that were not directly engaged. The courage which a commander-in-chief should display is different from that of a general division, and that of the latter is marked by a distinct shade from the bravery of a captain of grenadiers. Fourthly, the advance guard of the French army did not arrive on the 16th in front of Waterloo until 6 o'clock in the evening. It would have arrived at 3, but for some vexatious hesitations, the emperor was very much mortified at the delay and, pointing at the sun, exclaimed, "What would I not now give to have the power of Joshua and stop its movement for 2 hours?" Fourth observation, the French soldier never displayed more bravery, cheerfulness, and enthusiasm. He was animated with the sentiment of his superiority over all the soldiers of Europe. His confidence in the emperor was altogether unabated. It had perhaps increased, but he was suspicious and distrustful of his other commanders. The treasons of 1814 were always in his thoughts, and he was uneasy at every movement which he did not understand. He thought he was betrayed. At the moment when the first cannon shots were firing near Saint-Amand, an old corporal approached the emperor and said, "Sire, beware of General Soult. Be assured that he is a traitor." "Fear nothing," replied the emperor. "I can answer for him as for myself." In the middle of the battle, an officer informed Marshal Soult that General Van Damme had gone over to the enemy and that his soldiers demanded with loud cries that the emperor should be made acquainted with it. At the close of the battle, a dragoon, with his saber covered with blood, galloping up to him, crying, "Sire, come instantly to the division. General Denon is haranguing the dragoons to go over to the enemy." "Did you hear him?" "No, sire, but an officer who's looking for you saw him and ordered me to tell you majesty." During this time, the gallant General Denon received a cannon shot which carried off one of his thighs after he had repulsed the enemy's charge. On the 14th in the evening, Lieutenant General B, Colonel C, and V, an officer of the staff, deserted and went over to the enemy. Their names will be held in execration as long as the French people shall constitute a nation. The uneasy feelings of the troops had been considerably aggravated by that desertion. It appears nearly certain that the cry of "Sauve qui peut," say what you can, was raised among the soldiers of the 4th Division of the 1st Corps the evening of the Battle of Waterloo, when Marshal Blucher attacked the village of La Haye. That village was not defended as it ought to have been. It is equally probable that several officers charged with the communication of orders disappeared. But if some officers deserted, not a single private was guilty of that crime. Several killed themselves on the field of battle, where they lay wounded when they learned the defeat of the army. Fifth observation, in the battle of the 17th, the French army was divided into 3 bodies. 69,000 men under the emperor's command marched against Brussels by way of Charleroi. 34,000 under the command of Marshal Grouchy directed their operations against that capital by the way of Wavre in pursuit of the Prussians. 7,000 or 8,000 men remained on the field of battle at Ligny, of whom 3,000 belonging to Girard's division were employed in assisting the wounded and in forming a reserve for any unexpected casualty at Quatre Bras, and 5,000 continued with the forces of reserve at Fleurus and at Charleroi. The 34,000 men under the command of Marshal Grouchy, with the 108 pieces of cannon, were sufficient to drive the Prussian rear guard from any position it might take up to press upon the retreat of the conquered army and to keep it in check. It was a glorious result of the victory of Ligny to be thus enabled to oppose 34,000 men to an army which had consisted of 120,000. The 69,000 men under the emperor's command were sufficient to beat the Anglo-Dutch army composed of 90,000. The disproportion which existed on the 5th between the two belligerent masses in the relation of 1 to 2 was materially changed, and it no longer exceeded 3 to 4. Had the Anglo-Dutch army defeated the 69,000 men opposed to it, Napoleon might have been reproached with having ill calculated his measures, but it is undeniable, even from the enemy's admission, that unless General Blucher had arrived, the Anglo-Dutch army would have been driven from the field of battle between 8 and 9 o'clock at night. If Marshal Blucher had not arrived at 8 with his 1st and 2nd Corps, the march on Brussels with 2 columns during the Battle of the 17th would have been attended with several advantages. The left would have pressed upon and kept in check the Anglo-Dutch army. The right, under the command of Marshal Grouchy, would have pursued and restrained the operation of the Prusso-Saxon army, and in the evening the whole of the French army would have effected its junction on a line of less than 5 leagues from Mont Saint-Jean to Wavres, and its advanced post on the edge of the forest. But the fault committed by Marshal Grouchy in stopping on the 17th at Jean-Bleu, having marched scarcely 2 leagues in the course of a day, instead of pushing on 3 leagues more in front of Wavres, was aggravated and rendered irreparable by that which he committed the following day, the 18th, in losing 12 hours and arriving at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in front of Wavres, when he should have been there at 6 in the morning. First, Grouchy, charged with the pursuit of Marshal Blucher, lost sight of him for 24 hours from 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 17th until 12:15 at noon on the 18th. Secondly, the movement of the cavalry on the plain, while General Bulov's attack was not yet repulsed, proved a distressing accident. It was the intention of the commander-in-chief to order that movement, but not until an hour later, and then it was to have been sustained by 16 battalions of infantry belonging to the Guard, with 100 pieces of cannon. Thirdly, the horse grenadiers and the dragoons of the Guard, under the command of General Goyot, engaged without orders. Thus, at 5 in the afternoon, the army found itself without a reserve of cavalry. If at 8:30, that reserve had been in existence, the storm, which swept all before it on the field of battle, would have been dispersed, the enemy's charges of cavalry driven back, and the two armies would have slept on the field. Notwithstanding the successive arrivals of General Bulov and Marshal Blucher, the advantage would have been in favor of the French army, as Marshal Grouchy's 34,000 men with 108 pieces of cannon were fresh troops bivouacked on the field of battle. The enemy's two armies would have placed themselves in the night under cover of the forest of Soignes. The constant practice in every battle was for the horse grenadiers and the dragoons of the Guard never to lose sight of the Emperor and never to make a charge, but in consequence of an order verbally given by that prince to the general who commanded them. Marshal Mortier, who was commander-in-chief of the Guards, gave up the command on the 15th at Beaumont, just as hostilities were on the point of commencing, and no one was appointed in his stead, which was attended with several inconvenient results. Sixth observation. First, the French army maneuvered on the right of the Sambre on the 13th and 14th. It encamped the night between the 14th and the 15th within half a league of the Prussian advanced post, and yet Marshal Blucher had no knowledge of it, and when on the morning of the 15th he learned at his headquarters at Nemours that the Emperor had entered Charleroi, the Prusso-Saxon army was still cantoned over an extent of 30 leagues. 2 days were necessary for him to effect the junction of his troops. It was his duty from the 15th of May to advance his headquarters to Fleurus to concentrate the cantonments of his army within a radius of 8 leagues with his advanced posts on the Meuse and Sambre. His army might then have been assembled at Ligny on the 15th at noon to await in that position the attack of the French army, or to march against it in the evening of the 15th for the purpose of driving it into the Sambre. Secondly, yet notwithstanding this surprise of Marshal Blucher, he persisted in the project of collecting his troops on the heights of Ligny behind Fleurus, exposing himself to the hazard of being attacked before the arrival of his army. On the morning of the 10th, he had collected but 2 corps d'armée, and the French army was ready at Fleurus. The 3rd Corps joined in the course of the day, but the 4th, commanded by General Bulov, was unable to present itself in time for the battle. Marshal Blucher, the instant he learned the arrival of the French at Charleroi, that is to say on the evening of the 15th, ought to have assigned as a point of junction for his troops neither Fleurus nor Ligny, which were under the enemy's cannon, but Wavre, which the French could not have reached until the 17th. He would have also had the whole of the 16th and the night between the 16th and 17th to effect the total junction of his army. Thirdly, after having lost the battle of Ligny, the Prussian general, instead of making his retreat on Wavre, thought to have effected it upon the army of the Duke of Wellington, whether at Quatre Bras, where the latter had maintained himself, or at Waterloo. The whole of Marshal Blucher's retreat in the morning of the 17th was contrary to common sense, since the two armies, which were in the evening of the 16th little more than 3 miles from each other, and had a fine road for their point of communication, in consequence of which their junction might have been considered as effected, found themselves on the evening of the 17th separated by a distance of nearly 12 miles and intercepted by defiles and impassable ways. The Prussian general was guilty of a breach of the 3 grand rules of war. First, to maintain his cantonments near each other. Secondly, to assign a point of junction where his troops can all assemble before those of the enemy. Thirdly, to operate his retreat upon his reinforcements. Seventh observations. First, the Duke of Wellington was surprised in his cantonments. He ought to have concentrated them the 15th of May at 8 leagues about Brussels and maintain advanced guards on the roads opening from Flanders. The French army was for 3 days maneuvering close upon his advanced posts. It had commenced hostilities 24 hours. Its headquarters had been 12 hours at Charleroi, and yet the English general was at Brussels, ignorant of what was passing, and all the cantonments of his army were still in full security, extended over a space of more than 20 leagues. Secondly, the Prince of Saxe-Weimar, who belonged to the Anglo-Dutch army, was on the 16th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in positions before Frasne, and knew that the French army was at Charleroi. If he had immediately dispatched an aide-de-camp to Brussels, he would have arrived there at 6 in the evening. Yet the Duke of Wellington was not informed that the French army was at Charleroi until 11 at night. He thus lost 5 hours in a crisis and against a man, which rendered the loss of a single hour highly important. Thirdly, the infantry, cavalry, and artillery of that army were in cantonments so remote from each other that the infantry was engaged at Waterloo without cavalry or artillery, which exposed it to considerable loss, since it was obliged to form in close columns to make head against the charges of the cuirassiers. Under the fire of 50 pieces of cannon, these brave men were slaughtered without cavalry to protect or artillery to avenge them. At the three branches of an army cannot for an instant dispense with each other's assistance. They should be always cantoned and placed in a way to be of mutual service to each other. Fourthly, the English general, although surprised, assigned Quatre Bras, which had been for the last 24 hours in possession of the French, as the rallying point of his army. He exposed his troops to partial defeats as they gradually arrived. The danger which they incurred was still more considerable, since they presented themselves without artillery and without cavalry. He delivered up his infantry to his enemy piecemeal, and destitute of the assistance of the two other branches he should have fixed upon Waterloo for his point of junction. He would then have had the day of the 16th and the night between the 16th and 17th, an interval quite sufficient to collect the whole of his army, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The French could not have arrived until the 17th and would have found all his troops in position. Eighth observation. First, the English general fought the Battle of Waterloo on the 18th. That measure was contrary to the interests of his nation, to the general system of war adopted by the Allies, and to all the rules of war. It was not the interest of England, who wants so many men, to recruit her armies of India, of her American colonies, and her vast establishments, to expose herself with a generous vivacity to a sanguinary contest in which she might lose the only army she had and expend at the very least her purest blood. The plan of the Allies consisted in operating in a mass and in avoiding all partial actions. Nothing was more contrary to their interests and their plan than to expose the success of their cause in a doubtful battle with a nearly equal force in which all the probabilities were against them. If the Anglo-Dutch army had been destroyed at Waterloo, of what use to the Allies would have been the great number of armies that were preparing to cross the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees? Secondly, the English general, in accepting the Battle of Waterloo, placed his reliance on the cooperation of the Prussians. But that cooperation cannot be carried into effect until the afternoon. He therefore continued exposed alone from 4 o'clock in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. That is to say, for 13 hours. No battle lasts generally more than 6 hours. That cooperation was therefore an illusion. But if he relied upon the cooperation of the Prussians, he must have supposed that the whole of the French army was opposed to him, and he must consequently have undertaken to defend his field of battle during 13 hours. With 90,000 men of different nations against an army of 104 French. That calculation was evidently false. He could not have maintained himself 3 hours. The battle would have been decided by 8 o'clock in the morning, and the Prussians would have arrived only to be taken in flank. Both armies would have been destroyed in one battle if he calculated that a part of the French army had conformably to the rules of war pursued the Prussian army. He ought in that case to be convinced that he could receive no assistance from it, and that the Prussians beat it at Litz with the loss of from 25 to 30,000 men on the field of battle and 20,000 scattered and dispersed over the country and pursued by From 35 to 40,000 victorious French would not have risked any fresh operation and would have considered themselves scarcely sufficient to maintain a defensive position. In that case, the Anglo-Dutch army alone would have to sustain the shock of 69,000 French during the whole of the 18th, and there is no Englishman who will not agree that the result of that struggle could not be doubtful, and that their army was not constituted so as to be capable of sustaining the attack of the Imperial army for 4 hours. During the whole of the night between the 17th and 18th, the weather was horrible, and the roads were impassable until 9 o'clock in the morning. This loss of 6 hours from the break of day was entirely in the enemy's favor. But could the English general stake the fate of such a struggle upon the weather which happened in the night between the 17th and the 18th? Marshal Grouchy, with 34,000 men and 108 pieces of cannon, found the secret, which one would suppose was not to be found, of not being in the engagement of the 18th, either on the field of battle of Mont Saint-Jean or on Wavres, but had the marshal pledged himself to the English general to be led astray in so strange a manner. The conduct of Marshal Grouchy was as unexpected as that his army should on its march be swallowed up by an earthquake. Let us recapitulate. If Marshal Grouchy had been on the field of battle of Mont Saint-Jean, as he was supposed to be by the English general and the Prussian general during the whole night between the 17th and the 18th, and all the morning of the 18th, and the weather had allowed the French army to be drawn up in order of battle at 4 o'clock in the morning, the Anglo-Dutch army would have been dispersed and cut to pieces before 7. Its ruin would have been complete. And if the weather had not allowed the French army to range itself in order of battle until 10, the fate of the Anglo-Dutch army would have been decided before 1 o'clock at noon. The remains of it would have been driven either beyond the forest or in the directions of Hal. And there would have been quite time enough in the afternoon to go and meet Marshal Blucher and treat him in a similar manner. If Marshal Grouchy had encamped in front of Wavres in the night between the 17th and 18th, no detachment could have been sent by the Prussians to save the English army, which must have been completely beaten by the 69,000 French opposed to it. Thirdly, the position of Mont Saint-Jean was ill chosen. The first requisite of a field of battle is to be without defiles in its rear. The English general derived no advantage during the battle from his numerous cavalry. He did not think from that he thought to be and would be attacked on the left. He believed that the attack would be made on his right, notwithstanding the diversion operated in his favor by General Buyulov. 30,000 Prussians, he would have thrice effected his retreat during the battle, and had that measure been possible. Thus, in reality, how strange and capricious are human events! The bad choice of his field of battle, which prevented all possibility of retreat, was the cause of his success. Ninth observation. It may be asked, what then should have been the conduct of the English general after the Battle of Ligny and the engagement of Quatre Bras? On this point, posterity will not entertain two opinions. He ought, in the night between the 17th and 18th, to have crossed the forest of Soignes by the road of Charleroi. The Prussian army ought also to have crossed it by the road of Wavre. The armies would have effected a junction by break of day at Brussels, left their rear guards for the defense of the forest, gained some days in order to give time to the Prussians, dispersed after the Battle of Ligny, to join their army, reinforced themselves with 14 English regiments, which were in garrison in the fortresses of Belgium, or had been just landed at Ostend on their return from America, and let the Emperor of the French maneuver as he pleased. Would he, with an army of 100,000 men, have traversed the forest of Soignes to attack in an open country the two united armies consisting of more than 200,000 men and in position? It would have certainly been the most advantageous thing that could have happened to the Allies. Would he have been contented with taking up a position himself? He could not have long remained in an inactive state, since 300,000 Russians, Austrians, Bavarians were on their march to the Rhine. They would have been in a few weeks on the Marne, which would have compelled him to hasten to the assistance of his capital. It was then that the Anglo-Prussian army ought to march and effect its junction with the Allies under the walls of Paris. It would have exposed itself to no risk, suffered no loss, and have acted conformably to the interests of the English nation and the general plan of carrying on the war adopted by the Allies and sanctioned by the rules of the military art. From the 15th to the 18th, the Duke of Wellington invariably maneuvered as his enemy wished. He executed nothing which the latter apprehended he would. The English infantry was firm and solid. The cavalry might have conducted itself better. The Anglo-Dutch army was twice saved in the course of the day by the Prussians. The first time before 3 o'clock by the arrival of General Bülow with 30,000 men, and the second time by the arrival of Marshal Blucher with 31,000 men. In that battle, 69,000 French beat 120,000 men. The victory was wrested from them between 8 and 9 by 150,000 men. Let the feelings of the people of London be imagined had they been doomed to hear of the destruction of their army and the prodigal waste of their purest blood in support of the cause of kings against that of the people, of privileges against equality, of the oligarchs against the liberals, and of the principles of the Holy Alliance against the sovereignty of the people.